Hey everyone, here's Nico Renshaw from the Sanchon Foundation with another video about creating scenes using the Creator Hub. So in this video we're going to get technical and do some code. In the previous videos we talked a bit about smart items and we explored a few of the things you can do with them, and we saw that they're very powerful tools, really more powerful than you might expect. But of course they still have limitations, and that is where code comes in. With code you can do whatever you want, but you don't necessarily need to do everything with code. You can combine the two things. You can have the best of two worlds. You can lay out a few things with, the visual editor. You can configure even some smart items, and then just write code for the parts that require some extra, more customized logic. To manage the code in my scene, I'm going to need to install Visual Studio Code into my machine. Visual Studio Code is a pretty popular tool with developers. If you don't have it already, you can install it for free from code.visualstudio.com. It's available for all operating systems, and installation is pretty straightforward. You can also find a reference to this in our documentation. If you check out the Combine with Code page, you will see that there is also a reference to take you to the installation of Visual Studio Code, and you also find snippets and a lot of the code that we will explore in this very same tutorial. I also encourage you to check out the SDK Quickstart topic in our documentation. This little tutorial covers a few more basic steps, including how to import custom assets into your scene, but then focuses more on the code side of things and covers how you can replicate the same with code, and then also covers some of the stuff we'll see in this video about how you can fetch an item that you have added via the visual editor and how you can deal with that with code. Once you've installed Visual Studio Code in your machine, you can now come back to the Creator Hub and open your project. And if you click on this Code button up here, this will open up a new window with Visual Studio Code opened in your projects folder. So here you can see all of the files that make up my scene. And there's a few folders that we don't really care about. The .editor, .vs code are, just internal configurations you don't need to mess around with. The bin and node modules folder are output generated, we don't need to care about those. What we really need to care about is the assets folder, which contains all of the 3D models and other assets, sounds and images in my scene. If you actually check this out through the Creator Hub, you can see that in the local assets tab here, you will find essentially the same folder structure that you can find in Visual Studio Code. But then the more interesting part is the SRC folder. This is where you actually have the code for your scene. This folder contains all of the .ts files, which is TypeScript, where you actually have your custom logic for your scene. Every new scene starts with a single file called index.ts, but you can add as many .ts files as you want within the SRC folder. Now, one thing you should be aware of is if I just start writing code right here, this code will not be run by my scene. And the same goes if I add a new file and start writing code inside that new file. The reason is that my scene will only run code that is inside the function called main here in the index.ts. Now, of course, I can, write things that will be called indirectly by main. For example, I can define my own function, and I can reference this function from main. And when I do, now my function will be part of what is executed by my scene. So bear that in mind. Everything that you write into your scene should be directly or indirectly called through this main function here. So let's come back to our scene in the Creator Hub and add a couple of items that we'll be interacting with using code. So I'll add a couple of crates and we'll make these clickable. The easiest way to fetch a reference to an item that you added inside the visual editor is via name. You can use these same names that you see here on the left for the items. You can also change these names. For example, instead of writing gray blue crate, I would rather just write blue crate, just so that it's easier to reference from my code. So now let's come back to our code and let's add some references to these items. So you can write a constant and use a function engine.getEntity or null by name, and now just pass the name of the item as it is written on the Creator Hub. So you gotta make sure that you write it just the same with capitalization, spaces and everything. So your crate is 1, and let's just copy this line for the blue crate. Super, now let's make double sure that these items actually exist in my scene, because they might not, they might be written differently, I might, later delete these. So it's a good practice to add a little if statement just before I deal with these in any way. So now that we have references to the entities for these items, let's add some pointer events to these entities. So I can do pointer event system dot on pointer down and register a function that will run every time that this yellow crate entity is clicked. So whenever the entity is clicked, whatever I write into this function will be called every single time. In this case, let's simply do an engine.remove entity to delete the entity from my scene, just so that there's something visual that we can see whenever we click on the entity. Now let's just copy the whole thing for the other entity, which is the blue crate. And with this, I should be able to interact with both the yellow crate and the blue crate in my scene. So now if I hover my mouse over them, I can see the text collect, which is the hover feedback that I added in the pointer events function. If I click on them, they're gone. So of course what we just did here is a pretty basic and shallow kind of mechanic, and we could have done the same thing using the smart items functionalities and actions that we covered in other videos. But of course, when you're using code, you can do things that are way more advanced than what we just did. This was just an illustrative example, but say you were building some kind of a complex game with, I don't know, bullets and maybe these crates like were restocking your ammo, or maybe you had a whole inventory system in your game. You could do things that are way more advanced than what we just did. The last thing I wanted to cover is how you can also interact with smart items in your scene using code. So in the previous tutorial we covered how a smart item is really just an entity that contains some extra components. If I come here to the three dots and enable advanced mode, you can see the true contents of a smart item. In this case, this button right here also contains an action and a trigger component, and these are the really interesting parts of the smart item. The action contains all of the things that the button is capable of doing, and the trigger defines what events in the scene are capable of triggering these actions into happening. Let's go back to the basic mode. Now this button is configured to open this door in the scene, but just for the sake of making this example more interesting, let's remove this interaction and let's replicate the same thing through code. To make my life a little bit easier, let's just rename these. I'll change the button to just button and the door to just door. And now I can fetch them in my scene by these names. I'm going to copy the statement I already used before. And let's add an if statement. There are a couple of really handy functions on the SDK that allow me to deal directly with the action and the trigger component. So if I visit the documentation and look for the combine with code page, this is inside the scene editor section of the documentation, I'm going to be able to borrow a couple of lines from a snippet that will be super useful here. So I'm going to borrow these two lines, and these allow me to import two functions. There's the get trigger events and the get action events. Both of these functions allow me to fetch both the stuff from the trigger component and from the action component. And then this other line allows me to import a trigger type, which is a type that we'll be using as part of this statement. So now I'm going to define a reference to the button's triggers and another reference to the door's actions. Now both of these are objects that have a couple of built-in functions. So if I check out the button triggers, I'll see that there's a couple of functions it can do. The most important ones are on and emit. On is something that listens for events, and emit is something that can create events. So I'm going to use the on to listen for any events of type on input action, which is the kind of event that our button is using currently. And whenever an event of this type happens on the button, I'm going to run a function. And in this function, I am free to do absolutely anything I want. So with this I can hook on to the events of a button smart item and have a whole game that starts whenever the button is pressed. So I can, save all of the work that involves the actual buttons design and feedback and sound and all of that already comes packed in the smart item, and I can focus on the actual game mechanics of what happens whenever I click the button. In this case, instead of creating a whole world with my code, I'm just gonna instead reference the door smart item and make that open. So similarly to what we did with the triggers, I can do door actions and .emit. So now I'm going to give the door instructions to play the open action, which is defined as one of the actions inside the door smart item, and I don't need to pass anything as a second argument. In case I have any doubts about what kind of input action the button uses or what event names are inside the door, I can always check those out inside the smart items. So if I look at the advanced view of the button, I can see that the trigger is of type onInputAction, which is what we're using. And if I look at the advanced mode of the door, I can check out the names of the actions, and I can see that open starts with a capital O, by the way, which is important, is how the action is named. And now let's see if this actually works. There we go. Pressing the button calls the open action in my door, and we're doing this indirectly through code. Of course, we could have done this directly with the smart item configuration itself, but with code you can create a whole world behind that and have all kinds of custom logic to decide when the door should open, when it shouldn't, or start a whole game and open the door when you win the game, or whatever your heart desires. So anyway, I hope that you found this useful and can't wait to see what kinds of creative things you build with this. Thanks for watching and happy coding!